Hi everyone, this is Rob Watson, the module leader for TECH3501 and Community Media Leadership. That's what we're talking about. And this is an overview of the lecture for the third lecture for our series of lectures for 2017-18. And the title of this week's lecture, or next week's lecture, as it'll be because I'm doing it next week, is Motivations and Goals. And what I want to do is I want to kind of continue from last week where we talked about the idea of participation and how participation is a neutral process, but it's embedded in social situations and in social environments, life worlds. So what we want to look at this week is go through that in a little bit more detail, but narrow it down a touch so that we can kind of, we have an awful lot that we can think about, and it's a big world out there, and lots of people are doing lots of different things for different reasons, and the way that we account for those things also vary and change. So it's a big area to think about. So we'll recap the idea of participation, and we'll recap again about the approach that Herbert Blumer informs us of, and it's really the idea that we need to look at the social role of participation and what it is that participation does when it enters into, or the idea of participation or the practices of participation that are ascribed to participation, what they actually do and what they actually mean when they're enacted in group life. So they're not just viewed as an abstract series of hypothetical, theoretical concepts, but they're actually seen as a practical set of pragmatic social processes. So we'll look at this in the context of the kind of I'll just do a quick summary again of the kind of the different types of way that we can account for participation, or participation tends to be accounted for. So that's through notions of power and hegemony, through ecology and the kind of green argument, sustainability, through things like civil engagement, through technological change, and through the kind of structuring of social relationships, and that difference between the arbolic and the rhizomic. So those kind of key differences and what they mean in terms of what happens when the language and the way we describe the social environment that we're engaging with, what happens when the language changes. Because at some point, and this is drawing on the work of Richard Rorty, the terms that we use are that they're congruent, they make sense to us in one way, but then they become incongruent, and we build the new definitions on the basis of the old definitions, but we're applying them to different circumstances. So it's kind of like a moving target that we've always got to try and understand what drives the process of social change. Now the question is it participation itself which is an agent of social change, or is it something else? Are there other factors? And Blumer encourages to seek out and to look for and account for the other associated factors that go along with participation. In fact, participation might itself be the product of social change and not in itself the driver of social change. And we have to unpick that and account for that. So the way that we look at that is we'll look again at the framework of different types of participation, which gives us a kind of a mode of engagement with community media and community development. And we identified them briefly as the activist, the steward, the representative, the collaborator, those kind of things. And we can look at in the kind of context in which these are broadly situated. So they give us a kind of the terms that we use give us a symbolic framework in which we can think about and apply different types of analysis to what it means to be a community media activist and participant. So when we look at examples of how this operates and engages in group life, in the social world that we're part of, and part of the life worlds of the participants and the people who are engaged in community media, we have to think differently. We have to think in a way which is sociological. It adopts a view which says and understands the interactions of the social processes between people and groups of people. And these can be considered as a kind of, there's a generic set of social processes that we can start with. So how do people acquire a perspective on what they're doing? How do people gain a sense of identity and a kind of sense of self and self-identity about what they're doing? How do people recognize that they're able to do and create and engage with certain practices? What's the kind of sense of emotionality that accompanies this? It's kind of, is it overt? Is it explicit? Is it suppressed? Big issues. And in adopting these kind of practices, how do we communicate? How fluent are we about communicating in these kind of forms? So the idea is that what we've got to do to understand community media and to understand communities is we've got to be part of these communities, and we've got to relate to them. We've got to understand the kind of life world and what the kind of associations are and the kind of proficiency that you need to be an active and engaged member of a society, a member of a community. How do you become familiar with these terms, with these practices? So what we'll look at is we'll go through Herbert Blumer puts forward 9 themes for entry into group life that participation suggests that we should look for. So it's things like, how do jobs and positions and occupations come about? How do you go about filling and profiling the roles that these jobs suggest are available in new and changing circumstances? So think, the way that social media has arisen in the last decade or so, how people have adapted new forms of jobs to suit the new form of technology and the new form of social practices that go with it, and the new sense of understanding that comes from that. Where do these come from? What are they imbued with as a set of social roles? So there's a kind of structuring of social relations that go in these. So there's 9 points that we'll go through, and they give us if we follow them in any particular circumstance, it's quite an extensive set of questions that unpick an awful lot of information from different examples that we might look at. But what I want to focus on is the kind of what it leads to is a kind of sense of the going back to the roles that people play, and the kind of way that roles emerge, and what can we learn from how we understand what these roles are. So what are the kind of the occupations and the positions that people have. And we'll look at some of this in the workshop in terms of looking at some of the way that activists are identified and discussed and what they talk about. But we're going to look at this primarily within a kind of an off-the-shelf framework, which is the Myers-Briggs type indicators, which is the kind of the 16 personality types, the 4 groups of personality types, which are the artisan, the guardian, the rationalist, and the idealist. So we'll look at these in that kind of framework, and we'll see if we can use that as a way to maybe think through how people are engaged or drawn into or find valuable what community media offers to them. And we'll do that in a way which kind of hopefully gives us some indicators of how to think about developing community media projects and community development projects in the future when the circumstances can be so variable and so different. What is it we need to think about understanding how people interact and what social processes they're engaged in order to be able to do this successfully? Right, okay, I've gone on for ages. That was more than I intended to summarise, but a lot to do. The notes are up on the wiki, wiki.our.dmu.ac.uk. Just look for the TECH3501 page, and they're in the lecture notes section. So I'll see you at the lecture next week.